On today's show, we begin our Central Division season preview series, and we kick it off today with Jack Bushman of Locked On Chicago Blackhawks. We'll be talking all things Dallas and Chicago as far as it pertains to the 2022-2023 season. All coming up on this Monday episode of Locked On Stars.
Your Locked On Stars, your daily podcast on the Dallas Stars. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Howdy, Stars fans. Welcome back to the Locked On Stars podcast, the only daily in-season podcast covering the Dallas Stars, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Dane Lewis, your local expert on all things Dallas Stars hockey, credentialed member of the Dallas Stars media, coming to you on this Monday, September 5th. And whether this is your first time here or you are a recurring listener of the show, thank you for stopping by today's episode and for making Locked On Stars your first listen every single day. Be sure to hit that subscribe button if you're watching on YouTube. You can also find and follow us on your favorite podcasting platform as well. You can also find and follow me on Twitter at Dane_Lewis and our show as well. Just a simple at Locked On Stars. But I don't want to hesitate too much longer because we have a pretty lengthy episode today. A good talk with Jack Bushman over at Locked On Chicago Blackhawks, previewing the upcoming season for both the Blackhawks and the Dallas Stars. Let's get into that interview now. All right, welcome in everybody to this very special Central Division crossover episode, previewing the 2022-2023 season. This is Dane Lewis of the Locked On Dallas Stars podcast, joined now by Jack Bushman, host of the Locked On Chicago Blackhawks podcast. And Jack, how you doing, man? I know this offseason's been long, but hockey's just around the corner. September's here, training camp right around the corner, preseason games about to get started up here in the next few weeks. How are you handling it all?
Yeah, I'm excited. Hockey season is finally starting to close in. I apologize if you can hear my dog barking up a storm in the background. People always go walking by, so apologies for the timing on that. But yeah, hockey season right around the corner, Dane. And the Blackhawks actually, that they just announced they're going to be part of the 2022 Tom Curvers Showcase in just a couple of weeks. And they actually are going to have a scrimmage type game against the Minnesota Wild on a Friday night. And that's, I know when it's really going to set in, that's like, oh, wow, I'm going down to the city at 7:00. Hockey season is right around the corner, even though it's probably going to be a bit of a troubling year for the Chicago Blackhawks. I'm still super stoked for it and everything that also insinuates with hockey season. We got football season around the corner too, postseason baseball. This is a great time for sports after, the summer's a little bit lackluster to say the least. So I'm all for it, Dane. I couldn't be more excited. How are your thoughts about hockey season coming up?
Yeah, I'm right there with you. I think this summer in particular has just felt incredibly slow. Baseball is I personally enjoy baseball, but the Texas Rangers certainly not a team to write home about this season. So, getting excited for the start of football season where the Dallas Cowboys can disappoint me yet again. But hockey season, I think there's a lot of reasons to be excited. New coaching staff, new system here in Dallas, and a few new faces to the franchise, and some guys returning as well that I think can make an impact on this team and hopefully propel them to another playoff appearance where anything can happen. I think the Stars had an early exit last season to Calgary, but who knows how far they could have gone if they were able to be on the opposite end of that Game 7 overtime where Johnny Gaudreau scores the game winner for them. That's just a what if that'll have to be tackled another day, but certainly want to pick your brain a little bit about this Chicago Blackhawks team. Obviously a lot of turnover this offseason, and like you said, maybe not the most exciting season ahead, but hopefully building for brighter days. And I know one of the biggest departures, not just for the Blackhawks, but in the entire scope of the NHL, was Alex DeBrincat, now a member of the Ottawa Senators. Was that something that you were expecting to see happen? What were your overall thoughts on the DeBrincat departure?
Yeah, it was tough for sure. I will say that it was becoming abundantly clear in the days leading up to the first day of the NHL draft, where he ultimately got dealt, that it was a when and not if situation. All signs were pointing towards Alex DeBrincat being traded. And the one thing I will say about that is I knew it was coming, more than likely going to happen, but that also, it felt to me like the Blackhawks were in this situation where they didn't absolutely have to trade DeBrincat, even though all signs were pointing in that direction. But because things were kind of progressing, it made me feel like the Blackhawks were getting a really good offer, or they were hearing really good offers from other teams. And it was just a situation that they really couldn't pass up, given that they are heading into this long rebuild ahead. And Alex DeBrincat, even though he is a prime two-time 40-goal scorer at just 24 years of age, if we're thinking 5-6 years down the road, he's still going to be pushing 30. And I know that's something that Blackhawks fans will disagree on, but that was, I think, an idea that was going through Kyle Davidson's mind. And when we really heard these trade rumors starting to ramp up, I felt confident that the Blackhawks were going to get a very solid return on DeBrincat. And that's just not what happened, Dane. A very underwhelming return, if I'm being honest. Now, I understand that DeBrincat not signing an extension with Ottawa was probably the reason for that, but I still think this was by far the worst move that Kyle Davidson has made since he's taken over as GM for the Blackhawks. We only get one first-round pick for Alex DeBrincat. We don't take any prospects away from a pretty strong Senators prospect pool. We didn't get a single one. Theoretically, we got more back in return for Brandon Hagel. Now, the reason the Blackhawks netted 2 firsts for Hagel is because his contract situation is really good. He's signed on a very cheap deal for the next 2 to 3 years. DeBrincat wasn't in that same situation, but it still doesn't sit right with Blackhawks fans that we only got one first-round pick in that deal, and it was the 7th overall selection. Now, I am really high on the player they took with that pick, Kevin Korchinski. I think he has all the tools to be a really strong offensive defenseman in this league. The defense is something he's going to have to work at in years moving forward, but to not even get a top 5 pick and not the strongest of NHL drafts, and that's the lone first-round pick you got for a 2-time 40-goal scorer, that's why everyone across the board, fans everywhere of whatever team, said this was an absolute steal by the Ottawa Senators, and I don't really have any way to dispute that. So, yeah, it was, even though we kind of knew that DeBrincat was probably out the door, no one expected the return to be that low, Dane. So, yeah, that was kind of what added insult to injury in trading away one of the fan favorites here in Chicago.
Yeah, certainly a big blow to, that Chicago fan base. Obviously, like we've said, and very much in a rebuilding stage, but DeBrincat certainly a bright spot. A guy that, was an all-star this past year, however much stake that holds in NHL fans' hearts. But now he's gone on to an Ottawa team that, looks to be, pushing for a playoff spot in that Atlantic division. There was another departure as well, maybe one that's a little more under the radar, but one I'm certainly curious your thoughts on, just because this guy has shown flashes, but never really could, get his feet set in Chicago. And that's Kirby Daco, now a member of the Montreal Canadiens. What were your thoughts on his departure? Were you sad to see him go, or do you think that he just, was maybe being held back by the Blackhawks and now could take off with the Habs? What are your thoughts on Kirby Daco?
I was for sure saddened to see Kirby Daco, yet another first-round pick that only had a short time here in Chicago, and it was difficult for him. And to be fair, I really don't think the previous regime did him any favors by rushing him into the NHL so fast. He didn't get any time down in Rockford. It was just a really quick transition for him, and not one that he was probably ready for at that point. And as someone who has been a Kirby Daco backer, there are plenty of people here in Chicago that were already calling Kirby Daco a bust at 20 years of age, and were happy about this trade. I was saddened to see him go, and I do believe that Kirby Daco, while he may never live up to the 3rd overall pick expectations, he's a big kid who has some skating ability. He's responsible defensively, already took on really big tasks defensively as a 20 and 21-year-old. Like, that side of his game, I think, is probably going to be the strength when he gets older, like a second to third line two-way center who, maybe a 40, 50, I'm not going to rule out 60 points. That's probably the ceiling on him, though. I really feel like Kirby Daco can be an impact player, and once he's 26 and 27 years old, all this experience that he's had at an early age, I think, is really going to pay dividends. But with that being said, I was thrilled with the return that the Blackhawks got. The 13th overall pick was kind of but who they took with that 13th overall selection, Frank Nasar, my guy Frank the Tank, as I've already dubbed him, I'm stoked about this kid. I really am. high pace that he plays at. A lot of people critique his size, but he's a gamer, and he doesn't let that hinder any part of his game. The energy and the intensity that he brings, he's right there on each and every play, hustles, and has a really good offensive skill set to go along with it. So ultimately, I think the Blackhawks got the higher ceiling player in Frank Nasar, and I don't really have a complaint about that, especially with, if you go and look at the Blackhawks prospect pool, in particular at the forward position, it has been really thin for the last 5 to 6 years, and they really hadn't developed any talent. And in their current prospect pool prior to the draft, they had very little speed, and they knew they needed to address that more than anything. In today's NHL, it's just so fast. I mean, look at the Colorado Avalanche, the pace that they were playing at this year. It was remarkable, and the Blackhawks really didn't have any speed to bank on. And with Frank Nasar, they know they're getting high-end speed, and that was a common theme of a lot of their draft picks in this year's draft. So I like to see them address that. They're certainly building up the prospect pool for future years. And as tough as it was for me, I know it wasn't as tough for other folks here in Chicago to say goodbye to Kirby Daco. It was tough for me. I still have his jersey, and it's actually the first Blackhawks sweater I've ever had where a player's gotten traded. I know it's probably going to end soon as I have both Taves and Kane, but that was the first one where it's like, wow, what do I do with this sweater now? But I do think the Blackhawks at the end of the day got a really good return in that trade in particular. And now it's just kind of hoping that Frank Nasar can be the player that we all are wanting him to be in 3 or 4 years down the road.
Today's episode of Locked On Stars is brought to you by our friends at Built Bar. If you haven't tried Built Bar Puffs yet, you are depriving yourself of one of life's greatest joys. And guess what? There is a new flavor, delicious, indulgent cookie dough covered in chocolate. That's right, Built has done it yet again. All the joys of eating cookie dough without the hassle of making it, plus it's good for you. Cookie dough chunk puffs are only 160 calories, and they have a whopping 15 grams of protein in them. You're going to love the new cookie dough chunk puff. Whether you need a snack for your workout, a late night treat, or just need to grab a quick bite, Built is the perfect protein bar, and they taste better than a candy bar. Ditch the calories, fat, and sugar and grab yourself a Built Bar. You can grab one today by going to their website, built.com, and use our promo code LOCKED15, and you can get 15% off your order. Again, use our promo code LOCKED15 to get 15% off your order at built.com. You talk about Kane and Taves. That was kind of the last question I wanted to ask you before we flip the script here a little bit. It's really no secret that, especially Kane, he seems to have been, a pretty hot topic this offseason for trade talks and things of that nature. Do you think that he and Taves get traded before the season? Do you think they get traded around the deadline? What are your predictions as far as the future for Patrick Kane, Jonathan Taves with the Blackhawks, and how much longer do you think that they'll be in Chicago? And if they do get traded, where do you think they could potentially go?
Yeah, it's actually funny you bring that up because just about an hour ago, Ben Pope, who is a beat writer for the Chicago Sun-Times here, spoke with Kyle Davidson, and Davidson mentioned that neither Jonathan Taves nor Patrick Kane have approached them to waive their no movement clause as of this point. And that's kind of the storyline that's been going on for the past month. It just seems more likely that they're going to get traded at the deadline if they are going to get moved. It seems like they at least want to give this training camp a feel. The new coaching staff, we haven't touched on Luke Richardson yet, but a new head coach in there and someone who's really respected around the league. And he said all the right things, not only with understanding the direction of this franchise, but he knows that while the front office may be tanking, they're going in there to win every game. They're not throwing anything away. And I think that type of mindset, I know Richardson's already had conversations with Kane and Taves. I think that's probably convinced them to at least stick it out at this point. But given where the Blackhawks are at as a franchise, and with both of these two having their current deals expire at the end of the season, it is a little tough to see the Blackhawks 'Hawks bringing them back. And I'll start with Jonathan Taves. It's been a little odd how Taves really just hasn't committed himself to this franchise. He hasn't like outspokenly said, I want to leave or anything, but it is a little weird when your longtime captain, 3-time Stanley Cup champion, isn't directly committing himself to the franchise. And I don't want to throw any shade towards Jonathan Taves because, listen, after all he's done for this city and this franchise, he has the right to do whatever he wants to do. But it seems like, based on his words, he's probably the more likely of the two, I think, to waive his no movement clause first, or if, hypothetical, if only one of them is going to get traded, who do you think it would be? I do think it's Jonathan Taves. For Patrick Kane, the question is, how much does he value the franchise records and remaining here in the city of Chicago? And I guess you can throw the same thing to Jonathan Taves too, but I've heard people say that, and it could be true for all I know. Like, Patrick Kane could value staying with one franchise for his entire career more than I imagine. But these guys are winners, man. They came into this league as winners. That's all they really knew until about 4 or 5 years ago. And I'm sure it hasn't been easy for them. And I'm sure it's not easy for them knowing that they probably got 4 or 5 more years of this. So at the end of the day, they're both competitors, and I wouldn't blame them if they want to go elsewhere and try to win a Stanley Cup. And also, it could help the Blackhawks by doing so, considering the assets that they can get in return for moving these two pieces. So I do think it's more likely that they are both going to get traded than not. As for what team or what teams they could land on, it's going to be a little difficult. I know every team out there would love to add a talent like Patrick Kane to their roster, but given the financial situation right now in this post-COVID world, and no one seemingly has a lot of money who's competing for a Stanley Cup, right? It's really going to limit the amount of teams that actually are in play here. And then at the same time, Kane has to waive his no movement clause to go to this team. So does Jonathan Taves. So I'm sure there really aren't as many teams that are realistic options for these two as, fan bases across the NHL would like to admit. But I don't know what teams it's going to be, but I'm certain that it's only going to be a select few who are actually in contention when the time comes, assumingly around the trade deadline, Dane.
Yeah, it's certainly a storyline worth following throughout the rest of this offseason and certainly into the season as well, depending on, how the Blackhawks come out. And like you said, what training camp looks like and so on and so forth, what this prospect pool, what the young guys look like, probably going to factor heavily in to that decision. But now we'll take a moment and flip the script a little bit. And if you have any Dallas Stars related questions, that's what I'm here to talk about, to inform the good people that listen to Locked On Blackhawks, to give a little insight about a divisional foe.
Absolutely. Yeah, I have several questions about this Dallas Stars team. I'm torn. I don't know if they're going to be at the top, if they're going to be in the 5 or 6 spot. I really don't know. But this division, Dana, it does feel like it's up for grabs, and we'll touch on that a little bit later. But just first things first, I wanted to ask about just the offseason moves that the Dallas Stars have made or that they've been a part of. I would say the biggest departure would be John Klingberg going to Anaheim. That's a big leave for the defense, although I do think they're in a good spot still. They added Colin Miller. Let's talk about the defense first, because I've really thought that's been a strength for the Dallas Stars for the last few years. You'd know better than I would. Maybe you can touch on that a little bit. But I've always looked at the names that they have back there. It's just like, if they can get to the playoffs, they have a veteran and reliable D-core that they can lean on. How big is the departure of John Klingberg? And also, does the addition of Colin Miller help keep this defensive core intact where they can compete this upcoming season?
The departure of Klingberg was a pretty big one, and I think it was expected, as he's been in trade talks and, departure talks really since November of last season. I remember talking with, people connected to the Hurricanes and some other Eastern Conference teams, even back around Thanksgiving, about the idea of John Klingberg potentially going to their team, but he sticks it out with the Stars. I think a part of that was Miro Heiskanen getting sick around a week or two before the trade deadline hit. And so I think they needed to hold on to John Klingberg just because of that defense, but also offensively as well. He's maybe the second best defenseman in franchise history behind Sergei Zubov, and just the way that he was able to produce offensively, especially in the postseason, was just massive for the Stars franchise. And, the Stars drafted him. He was developed by the Stars and became a fan favorite, especially on the defensive front. But now he's gone on to Anaheim. So this is the Miro Heiskanen show in Dallas for defensemen. And Colin Miller, I think, will be definitely a nice add. I don't think that, it changes the look of this team as far as maybe where they could end up on the standings, but it's always nice to have veteran depth defensively. I mean, you have a guy like Ryan Suter, who, in my opinion, is probably a little bit overpaid by the Stars, but still a nice veteran presence to have on the team. Yanni Hakanpää proved himself to be a guy that can be in the rotation with his size. And then Thomas Harley, a guy that we've talked a lot about this offseason here, with plenty of other guests on Locked On Stars. The 2019 first round pick for the Stars, rather, not first overall. A guy that has shown a lot of promise and a lot of potential within this organization, getting some limited NHL minutes under Rick Bowness, but now with Pete DeBoer as the new head coach, I think a lot of people expect him to have a good training camp and expect him to be a consistent player somewhere in that six-man defensive core rotation. So I think defense will certainly still be a big part of the Dallas Stars' identity. It's just going to look a little bit different with some new leadership, with Miro Heiskanen finally being the number one guy, and Thomas Harley, Yanni Hakanpää, Ryan Suter, Esa Lindell, all trying to find where they fit in as well in this kind of new look Dallas Stars system.
For sure. And then moving on to the forward position too, a really big, I would say, impact made last year by not the usual guys that were leading the charge for the Dallas Stars, right? You see the emergence of Jason Robertson, who he still needs to, that whole deal still needs to be figured out, right? They're still waiting on that.
Correct.
Okay, but he's going to be back. They're not going to let him go. That's just ridiculous. But he has a great year. Rupe Hintz has been someone who's really jumped out the last few years as well. It's a good forward group when I look at it on paper. I wanted to get your thoughts, though, on Jamie Benn and Tyler Seguin, because it feels like as these new wave of players have kind of become the forefront of the Dallas Stars, the top line last year with Joe Pavelski, Hintz, and Robertson did a lot of the heavy lifting, it felt like. And personally, as someone who was ever gambling props on the Stars, those were literally the only three guys I would take stuff on because it felt like they always did all the damage. Do you feel like Jamie Benn and Tyler Seguin are capable of doing bigger things this year? I know they're both on the wrong side of 30 at this point. At Seguin, Seguin's 30 now too, which is kind of crazy to think about. Are you feeling like they're capable of having a bigger year than they did last year? Because I felt like, at least from an outsider's perspective, it felt like the offense was really relied on that top line from time to time, and those guys weren't doing their part. And that to me felt like it cost the Dallas Stars a little bit. Can you kind of reflect on that? And if I'm wrong, tell me I'm wrong.
No, you're definitely onto something there. And plenty of people here in Dallas are very critical of Seguin and Benn, and I think that just comes with part of being a leader of the team. Jamie Benn been the captain for several years now, and Tyler Seguin has worn the A for alternate captain on his jersey for several seasons as well. And there was a time back when the Blackhawks were winning their championships that Benn and Seguin were the premier players in Dallas and putting up, 80, 90, close to 100 points every season. But now, like you said, they're both on the other side of 30 now. I think Seguin just recently turned 30, but, even back in that Stanley Cup run against the Tampa Bay Lightning, he was playing with pretty much just his upper body. His lower body had just been absolutely destroyed in the postseason back in 2020. And so he was, coming off surgery and coming off rehab. And so I just don't know how many games he was playing last season at 100%. So hopefully this season he's a lot healthier and a lot more up to game shape, not feeling as much pain. Obviously, hockey is a very physically demanding sport, so we can't expect it to last like that all the time. But hopefully we'll see a little bit more of a refreshed Tyler Seguin this season. And kind of the same goes for Jamie Benn. He's a very physical player who, is not afraid to throw his body around, despite being a forward who can score pretty effectively as well. And I think he's just maybe started to take on a little bit of a different role. And really the issue with a lot of fans here in Dallas is just how much they're getting paid. They're both getting paid over $9 million a season. I think we still have Seguin for 5 more years. Seguin until 26-27 and Benn until 24-25. So both those guys taking up a quarter of the cap space on this team, yet both of them, just being mid-level scoring producers. It's just odd to see because, like you said, they've kind of just been the big names associated with this team. But I do think that both of them are certainly capable of having bounce-back seasons, especially now with Pete DeBoer as head coach, like we've talked about throughout this show. I think he has a tendency to get the most out of his veterans. We've seen that in Vegas. We saw it especially in San Jose. Brent Burns, Thornton, Pavelski, who's now in Dallas as well. A lot of those guys played really well under Pete DeBoer, despite being, in their early to mid 30s. So I'm really excited to see where they get placed in this lineup, how the coaching staff draws up the starting lineup on opening night, and how those guys are able to produce with this new staff and with this new system.
For sure. And a big signing today that the Dallas Stars made as well with, I got two more questions for you. This one, the goaltender position, especially with Jake Oettinger and what I got to see from him in the first round series against Calgary. I mean, that game 7 was absolutely incredible. And you just ink him to a deal today. I also feel like Scott Wedgwood is a very quality backup to have. And once you got him, I felt like he played pretty well for Dallas last year too. How do you feel having these two now signed on for multiple years, not just 1 year, but both of these guys signed multi-year extensions? Do you feel like the Dallas Stars goaltender position is in a really good spot? And also, what are your thoughts on the ceiling of Jake Oettinger? Because he flashed it a little bit in the Stanley Cup playoffs last year. I don't know if, the pressure is something that you're worried about after that short of a stint and people talking him up, but what do you think the ceiling is for Jake Oettinger?
Yeah, I for one, to start with the first part of that question, I'm very relieved now to know that Jake Oettinger is back and that Wedgwood, also a member of this team, like you said, for the next couple of seasons as well. Very, very good backup. His first game in Dallas on the road in Carolina, he had, I think, 44 saves that game and ended up helping them get the win in overtime. So a guy that can certainly go toe-to-toe with any team in the league. But Oettinger, far and away, set to be the number one goalie in Dallas this season, which I'm very excited to see how he does to follow up that Stanley Cup playoff performance. That Game 7 was such a thrill to watch just in general, but made better by the goalie performance from Markstrom and Oettinger as well. I think that there is certainly a ton of pressure built up that maybe could get to him this season. But I personally am just optimistic to see him perform this season because anything we've seen from Jake Oettinger in his short career up to this point has shown us that he's an incredibly hard worker, and he's willing to admit whenever he has a bad night and when he makes mistakes, but he's also willing to put in the work to get better, to improve, and he has a great relationship with Jeff Reese, the goalie coach in Dallas, and I know the team also just has a ton of trust in him night in and night out, which I think is important for any goaltender because I think half the game with being an NHL goalie is confidence. You have the confidence, and then the rest comes after that. Jake Oettinger certainly has the ability and the capability to be a good goalie night in and night out. As far as ceiling, it maybe just feels like a stretch or an overreach, but I really do think in the next 3-4 seasons, if he's able to stay healthy, which he's also done a good job of, knock on wood, up to this point in his career, I think we can legitimately, have him in the conversation of maybe a top 5 or maybe even top 3 goalie in this league. Certainly still has quite a ways to go. Still a lot of his career ahead of them. But if his early career has been any indication, there's a lot of reason for Stars fans to be excited to have Oettinger in Dallas for the next 3 seasons.
For those listening that do not know, probably more so on my end, Jake Oettinger is still only 23 years old. So there is an insanely bright future for this kid. And yeah, he showcased a little of it in that first round series against the Calgary Flames, where literally I don't know who was going to win because both goaltenders were just absolutely standing on their head. It was exactly how a Game 7 should be. But what I wanted to move on next to, Dane, is something that we already referenced a little bit earlier on in the episode, but the Locked On Podcast Network recently released their Central Division NHL projected standings for this upcoming season. And I recently had a crossover episode with Seth Topal from Locked On Wild where we kind of talked about this. And outside of the Colorado Avalanche, I do believe this division is very up for grabs, and there's a lot of spots where I don't know who's going to land in them, and I don't think any team is the epitome more of that in this division than the Dallas Stars. Maybe the Winnipeg Jets too, because I have absolutely no idea what they're going to be doing, but I'm just really torn on whether or not this is going to be a good Stars team or if they're going to finish more towards the bottom of the pack. Like, I can make a case for both sides, honestly. So I really wanted to get your thoughts on just all the offseason moves that they've made and whether or not you think the Stars have the ability to get back in the Stanley Cup playoffs next year.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I 100% agree. I think, the 2 to 5 spots in the 2 seed, 3 seed, 4 seed, 5 seed spot in this division are wide open. I think Colorado, if they stay healthy, very clearly going to take that number 1 spot. I think Chicago, Arizona kind of round out that bottom 2. Winnipeg, I also don't really know what to think on them. I think similar to how you think about the Stars, I can make a case for and against the Jets, but Nashville, Minnesota, St. Louis, Dallas, I think, yeah, it's literally wide open, and it's one of those things that I go back and forth on, and I'm obviously biased towards the Stars, but I legitimately think that they have a case to maybe crack a top 3 spot, and if they do get top 3 in the division, I think it would be 3rd, but I think more realistically, they end up getting a wild card spot similar to this last season, and I think Nashville also falls into that as well. I know they were 4th on the rankings when polled by all of the Locked On NHL hosts, which, at Nashville being Dallas's biggest rival, I disagreed with a little bit, but, Dallas's first 2 games of the season are against the Predators. So as if hockey season being close wasn't exciting enough, I get to see how those games play out and see those 2 teams go at one another. So it's going to be really interesting to see how it plays out. I personally, as of right now, think the Stars are going to make the playoffs. I think Peter DeBoer teams tend to overachieve in their first season. I don't know if you know this or if a lot of Chicago Blackhawks fans in general know this, but Pete DeBoer with the San Jose Sharks, the Devils first, then the Sharks, and then the Golden Knights did really well in his first season. Made the Stanley Cup Finals in his first season with the Devils and Sharks. He lost both times, but still made it, and then made it to the Western Conference Finals with the Vegas Golden Knights in his first season there, where they lost to the Stars in 2020. So, not saying that makes the Stars a lock for the conference finals or anything like that, but his teams do tend to overachieve in year one. And just in general, his teams historically, with the right talent, which I think the Stars have some really good talent in place, they have a chance to make the postseason. And with the Central Division being as wide open as it is, I think that they have a really good shot to find a spot somewhere in those 8 playoff teams. Because the Pacific Division, they have some good teams, but I can't really see more than 3 teams making it out of that division either.
No, I'm in the same boat there. That is a very interesting tidbit that I was not aware of whatsoever about Peter DeBoer. And to be 100% transparent here, I did, when I was going through my rankings, I had the Stars coming in 3rd. I had the Minnesota Wild. I had the Colorado Avalanche first. I had the St. Louis Blues second. I had the Dallas Stars coming in 3rd because I think at the end of the day, you know what you're getting out of their defense and their goaltending. Now, maybe I'm being a little bit too high on a 23-year-old Jake Oettinger, but I feel like having that type of defense, even though they lost John Klingberg, I still feel like they have a lot of good pieces in place that have been there for a while too, and some other guys that you mentioned like Thomas Harley and Hakanpää. I feel like it's a good structured defense for the Stars, and I know what I'm getting out of that group than what I think, at least, compared to some of the others in the Central Division. So, yeah, I had the Stars coming in 3rd, but who knows, man? It's going to be a very fun regular season for the Central Division, and I definitely agree that it's going to have 4 teams coming out of it at least, because I think looking at the Western Conference, it's pretty clear that this is the meat of the Western Conference, and it should make for a fun season, especially for your team. My team's probably not going to be doing a whole lot of that competing thing, but for the Dallas Stars and their fans, I'm sure it's going to be a very fun year from start to finish.
Yeah, I certainly hope so. And kind of maybe one more question for you as far as, the Central Division before we go, just giving a little bit of a future outlook, really just for the Stars fans. I know maybe Blackhawks fans might be a little more familiar with your thoughts on this if you've touched on it, but when can you realistically see the Chicago Blackhawks being in that playoff conversation yet again? Clearly not really set to happen this year, but like you said, they have some nice prospect pieces now being added, and maybe this season they make some trades at the deadline that give them some draft capital, or they get some young, exciting prospects. When can you realistically see the Blackhawks back in playoff contention?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Dane. I'm glad you asked it. It's going to be a little bit, that's for sure. The one thing I will say that gives me a strong belief that it's going to be, there is this 3 to 5 year kind of projection that's kind of been put out there to the Chicago fans. And a lot of people feel like it could be longer. It could be 7, 8 years. And to that, I would say, look at what the Blackhawks, not even the Blackhawks, look at what Kyle Davidson did in just his first couple months as general manager. Aside from the Alex DeBrincat trade, I really have no complaints whatsoever because he's been very open about what the Blackhawks were going to do. They need to build back better through the draft. They need to do a much better job at developing ingrown talent. They've just been trading for guys left and right, and that's why they don't have a good prospect pool, because in order to go get other talent, they'd have to give up something in return because they weren't properly developing guys in their minor league system. They know they got to hone on that. They got to get as many future assets as possible. And just his first NHL draft as general manager, Kyle Davidson, we went from having no first-round picks to having 3 by the end of the day, and we ended up with 11 selections overall in those 8 rounds. And the Blackhawks already have 2 first-round picks in next year's 2023 NHL draft, which is rumored to be one of the deepest in several years, even decades potentially. And the Blackhawks already own 2 first-round picks in that draft, and that's without trading Patrick Kane. That's without trading Jonathan Taves. And there are other assets that they're going to be trying to move out to get as much draft capital as possible. And I don't think it's unreasonable at all, Dane, to think the Blackhawks could have 3 or 4 first-round picks in the 2023 NHL draft. They have 2 first-round picks already in the 2024 NHL draft. It's clear they know what they need to do, and that's build back up through the draft and properly develop these guys coming through the system. Now, with that being said, likely means it's still going to be a process, but I think in 4 or 5 years, I know that's for Blackhawks fans, they're going to be like, oh my God, that's 2030. What are we doing here? I understand. It's a daunting task and it doesn't sound great, but we're going to have, I'm really hopeful, we're going to have so many first round picks and hopefully some high first round picks as well. I mean, that's the name of the game right now. If they could snag something in the top 3 next year, it would be lovely. Kind of get that hopeful superstar piece that you need to have to be a true contender in this league. That, that outlook is what's giving me hope right now. And knowing what Kyle Davidson was able to do in this year's draft, I'm sure he's going to be just as aggressive in both 2023 and 2024. So they know what they have to do here at least. And there is a plan set in place. And so far through his first offseason, again, other than the Alex DeBrincat trade, I think he's done a pretty good job. So it really is Kyle Davidson's tenure here in Chicago. It's very evident now, and hopefully he can just continue along this path that he's been on for the most part here in his first 6-7 months as general manager. That's really the only way the Blackhawks can go about this right now. You got to be thinking about the future and hope you can hit on some draft picks. So that's what I'm looking forward to, Dane. And yeah, it's going to be a while for sure, but if they can hit on these picks, I think 4 to 5 years. And if he does it right, I'll tell you what, people aren't going to be complaining about how long it took if the Blackhawks are competing for a Stanley Cup in 4 or 5 years. People aren't going to be complaining about that again. So hopefully all goes well. But yeah, it is still going to be a little bit regardless.
Absolutely. Certainly no fun to have to go through a rebuild. But like you said, if it's done right and it's done properly, fans tend to forget the years of sorrow and suffering and, tend to bask in the moment of, what winning a Stanley Cup feels like. And, the pieces seem to be in place as far as current draft picks and the opportunity to maybe acquire some more assets in the future. So we'll see what becomes of the Blackhawks, and we'll see what becomes of the Stars this season as well. But Jack, this was super fun. Always a good time to talk hockey with other Locked On NHL hosts, and maybe we'll get to cross over again sometime this season when our teams meet up.
Oh, absolutely. I'd love to. I don't know the schedule off the top of my head, so I don't know when the Blackhawks and Stars first meeting is, but I'd love to get a crossover together with you and kind of break down where our teams are at that point and all that good stuff. I'm always down for that.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll make it happen. Well, I certainly hope you guys enjoyed today's Central Division crossover episode between Locked On Stars and Locked On Chicago Blackhawks, the first of many Central Division preview shows coming up. Next episode on Wednesday, we will be talking with Harrison over at Locked On Winnipeg Jets. The Jets and Blackhawks in different places. The Chicago Blackhawks certainly going into a rebuild season, but as you've just heard, still a lot of interesting things happening within that organization. They could be on the rise here in the next few years, and We have a familiar friend now as the bench boss in Winnipeg, and Rick Bowness. We'll talk all about that and more on Wednesday's episode with Harrison of Locked On Jets. But thank you guys for tuning in to today's episode of Locked On Stars, for making us your first listen of the day, for subscribing on YouTube, following on your favorite podcasting platform. Thank you for leaving a 5-star rating and or review if you like the show, if you want to help other people find the show. Hockey season will be here before you know it, and thousands upon thousands of people are going to be scrounging the internet for daily Dallas Stars content because the Dallas Stars are their favorite team, and dang it, they think that they're going to go all the way this year. And what better place for them to get their hopes up than right here at the Locked On Dallas Stars podcast. So thank you guys for the continued support. Take care of yourselves. Have a great Monday. We'll see you back here on Wednesday for another Central Division preview episode.